So there's no real way for me to open up this video. I'm a kinkster. Here's me as a dog, here's me as a drone, and here's me as a gimp. Obviously, these pictures are pretty tame, but they give you an idea. I like rubber quite a lot. I like to say I know the exact event that made me get into rubber, and the story's quite mundane. I was out fabric shopping one day, I got to feel latex sheeting for the first time, and well, instant boner. The truth is, it wasn't that that moment made me into rubber, it was more that I was already into rubber, I just didn't know what it was yet. This thing that I had known that I was into for a very long time finally had an identity in my mind. Now, this revelation might be a shock to a lot of you, but I'm actually fairly open about all of my kinks and fetishes in my live streams and in my daily life. I don't see it as something to be ashamed of. Yes, there is a time and a place to talk about it, but I do just see kink and fetish as an extension of my sexuality, just as much as being gay is. And this is a point that we'll actually come back to. I also happen to like comic books, if the 500+ videos about comic books on this channel didn't already give that away. I first started reading comics when I was about 2 years old. I didn't understand everything that was happening, and my ability to read was very, very basic, but I knew I liked what I was looking at. And I was really, really lucky where I had parents that sort of had a bit of a hands-off attitude to the media I consumed. Their mindset was just, well, if I could understand the words and I could understand the context of the words, then I was old enough to be reading it. And if I couldn't understand the context of the words, then no harm done. But to be fair, at the same time, they also felt it was appropriate to show me as a very young child Stephen King's It, Beetlejuice, a plethora of horror movies, and conversations about sex and sexuality were kind of never off the table. Like, I was never afraid of sex and I was never taught to be afraid of sex. But at the same time, I was made very, very aware that you could only have sex as an adult due to consent, because you cannot consent to the emotional experience that comes with sex till you are an adult. But if a comic book had a sex scene, they just didn't care. And during that time period, there was quite a lot of sex happening in the X-Men, in the Titans. Sex, sex, sexy sex. Just a lot of really sexy comics. To clarify, I wasn't sat there reading porn as a child, but I was reading like sexy superhero comics. Now, before we get any further into this video, I do just have to shout out Mr. RIEGILLIO. They supplied the tracksuit that I'm wearing today. Prior to making this video, I actually contacted them and told them about the series of kink and fetish videos that I'm making and asked if they would like to work with me on them. And they agreed to send me this tracksuit for this video. They're amazing for agreeing to work with me, and I will be talking more about them at the end, so please stick around for that. As you can probably tell, this is going to be a very intense video with a lot of very mature topics. So I think we should be conservative in our approach so that we can command respect of the situation. Fuck that! Let's go to a dungeon and do sex drugs! Chapter 1. Kink versus fetish. What are those? So, sex scenes. When I was about 12 or 13 and I was entering puberty, they never really did anything for me. And to this day, naked people, no matter how attractive, just don't really do anything for me. I spent a number of years thinking I was asexual or that there was something wrong with me. I knew I wanted to be with men and was interested in men romantically, but when it came to sex, I just wasn't interested. Meanwhile, certain scenes and scenarios made me feel things. For example, in the New Titans, there is this scene where Dick Grayson has been brainwashed by Brother Blood and has been forced to wear this strange uniform. And the other Titans have been shackled against the wall, and Dick Grayson is being commanded to kill off the other Titans. You see, the thing about people with fetishes is that our sexuality revolves around taking something that is inherently non-sexual and then turning it into a sexual thing. The scene features a total power exchange in the form of mind control and the forced uniform. Meanwhile, the other Titans being shackled up against the wall is a form of bondage. And then you have Brother Blood as a total dominating presence across the entire scene. And this isn't the only example. William's entire arc from the cartoon Code Lyoko was a huge thing for me. You'd think knowing I had these feelings, it would be pretty obvious I was into kink, but I had two pretty big mountains to get over. The first was the shame side of things. Now, I don't really want to delve too much into the philosophy of shame here. ContraPoints already did a fantastic video on that topic. But this video helped me retrospectively realize that I was ashamed of the unidentified feelings that I was having, because these feelings weren't normal. Because, and this is the second mountain I had to get over, sex scenes were always portrayed as between a man and a woman and without any fetish gear, two things that do not apply to my sexuality. This meant the only frame of reference I had for what I was feeling was through looking at men in tight outfits in comic books. And now look at me! Now, this might be a lot for some of you to take in. I can empathize. It's a lot for me to be this open with all of you. This is like a really super fucking vulnerable moment for me. So let's get some simple facts out of the way before we continue. Sweaties. Number 1, do I believe the influence comic books had on my psyche made me a kinkster? In a word, no. I believe that I was both born gay and born predispositioned to be a fetishist to some degree. Yes, I believe a lot of what I was exposed to and experienced shaped those fetishes, but I believe my psyche and sexuality exists in a way where it takes experiences and turns those into fetishes. There's actually quite a good bit of research on this topic, some of which I'll touch on in this video. But number 2, and this is important, everyone's experience with kink and fetish is very individual, from the lived experience to the individual's psyche to the individual's identity. For example, I identify as shit. This really hit home for me earlier this year when I was visiting 2 friends in their flat a few weeks before they moved, and somehow the topic of kink and fetish came up, and one of them said something to the effect of, you really can't tell much about a person based on the type of sex they like to have. And for the most part, I agree with that statement. But also to me, kink and fetish are a bit more than just sex. They're an emotional experience. They help me bond with people who are in a similar boat. This was driven home further when I was in Berlin in September. So an event called Folsom would have been that weekend. And the COVID rate was low, so a bunch of guys decided to gather anyway. And a lot of the guys there were really worried about the backlash we'd experienced for gathering during COVID. But one of the other guys there pointed out that this really wasn't a want for a lot of the guys there, it was kind of a need. You see, for most people who have a typical sexuality, it's very easy for them to find people that they relate to. But for kinksters and fetishists, these events are kind of the only time of year where they can find people they relate to. Fetish events like that are more about mental health than anything else. If it was just about the sex, people would just keep meeting up like normal people do. And I have to say, after I went to that event, I felt more like myself than I had since March. And again, I want to reiterate, that was my first ever fetish event and my first ever time being around that many guys in rubber at once. And I made some really close friends there, some of whom I talk to daily. Another thing that's interesting to me is, in my personal life, I'm quite open about being into kink. Obviously, unless you're willing to keep this a secret between me and the other 140,000 of you. And what's interesting is how the definition of kink changes depending on who you're talking to. And I think this is in large part because of the huge crossover with the term fetish. So let's break down the difference now. A fetish is a fixation on a specific object, body part, or scenario that is inherently non-sexual, but it is a psychological requirement for an individual to achieve sexual pleasure. We spoke about this earlier. You might have a rubber fetish, a hypnosis fetish. Some people have hand and feet fetishes. But one or more of an individual's fetish tends to be psychologically necessary for them to achieve sexual pleasure. In my own experience, this does directly tie into the fact that I felt asexual until I found rubber. And then the whole fetish world from there. So what about kink? Well, kink is more of a broad term. It's basically used to describe things that exist outside of normal sex. So this is how you shape the dynamic with whoever you're playing with. So this includes roleplay, BDSM, forced workouts. So basically, all kinks are someone's fetish. So far, we've spent a long time talking about the explicit sexual side of kink and fetish, but there is a social side of things. So where does the sex stop and social begin? Well, when you spend enough time on this scene, sooner or later you will hear the phrase, Chapter 2, Social, Not Sexual. So I'll be honest, I actually do know who originated this phrase, and the phrase is ironic. But that's not what I want to focus on here, because the truth is, there is a weird truth to this phrase. Before we go further, we do need to acknowledge something. Friendships form in different ways, and how they form will create a dynamic in that friendship. The friends I've made through cosplay and anime have a very different friendship with me compared to the friends I was in a wrestling team with in university. Both types of friendships are completely valid, but I will show different sides of myself in these friendships because humans are dynamic. This rule also applies to the kink scene. If I play with a guy and I'm his sub in that scene, that means we have spent a few days planning said scene, and plus during the scene I've been his sub for a few hours on top of that. That's a long time to be in the mindset of being a guy's sub, but the thing is, when the scene ends, that mindset has to end, and there has to be something there to maintain our bond, and that is usually a friendship. Typically, this bond is just friendship, nothing more. But where this bond begins is different for everyone. So while what may initially spark our bond might be our mutual fetishes, it's really rare that that will be the only thing I'll bond with a guy over. Just like all friendships, we have lots of things that might interest us that maintain our bond. In fact, the non-fetish things you discuss might actually shape how you do each scene. For example, back in September, I played with a guy who happened to know that I hadn't actually worked out since March and I was planning on getting back into working out. So he included some forced workout aspects of our scene. Our dynamic in that scene ended up becoming that of a jock and a coach. I want to stress this is a highly specific type of friendship, but I believe my bonds with these people grow much faster because it's in our best interest to be open with each other to a certain degree. However, it's not lost on me that the idea that there is a kink or a fetish community is almost alien for a large number of people. Most people tend to think of kink as hot sex, that's weird. Yes, it can be, but when you consider that people who have similar sexualities tend to form communities, it makes perfect sense that people who are into fetish and kink would form a community around their shared sexuality. However, I want to stress, I am only talking about the gay male fetish community here. I am not in the position to be talking about the straight community or the bi community because I am not straight nor am I bi, and there is not a straight person or a bi person in this room who could talk about those communities. Full of this talk about sexualities and individual identities, let's talk about Pride. Pride is probably the biggest non-sexual social event of the year for kinksters around the world. As we all know, Pride is a month dedicated to celebrating LGBTQ+ history, and it dates all the way back to the Stonewall riots and the gay liberation marches, which happened all through the 70s. Pride for the LGBTQ+ kink and fetish community is probably the biggest social event of the year. And I say the biggest social event very intentionally, because for the most part, there's no kinksters having hot sex, that's weird, on the street. All in all, kinksters are very aware that this isn't an event just for them. You get people from every different walk of life at Pride, but yet you still get the odd Karen and Christine saying, I want to bring my child to Pride, how am I supposed to explain leather daddies and rubber men to them? To which I say, Pride is not for your child, it has never been for your child, and if a leather daddy is too hard for you to explain to your child, you might want to do a bit more research on the history of Pride itself. Pride is kind of seen as an adult event in the LGBTQ+ community that has been lost over the years as Pride has become more gentrified and more straight people turn up. But it is not a music festival, it's not a general parade, it is for the adults of the LGBTQ+ community. So the reason kink and fetish is at Pride is because the history of Pride is inherently tied to the gay kink and fetish scene. Back in the 1970s, at the San Francisco Gay Liberation March, one of the biggest liberation marches in the world before the liberation marches even turned into Pride festivals, it was spearheaded by a group of women known as the Dykes on Bikes, who are part of the lesbian leather community. Then, back in the 1950s, you had a group of leather men known as the Satyrs. They actually formed the longest running LGBTQ+ motorcycle club, to the point that the group's bylaws are often adopted and appropriated by other LGBTQ+ motorcycle groups to this day. The Satyrs went around the United States fighting for gay rights before the liberation marches. Then at Stonewall, you had leather daddies joining in on the riots. The history of Pride is the history of fetish at Pride. The two are tied together. You cannot have one without the other. This is something I'd like to explore more later next year, but I'll be honest, at the moment, I'm only educated on the basics of this topic, so I'm just gonna kind of leave this topic here. So while it may not be palatable to a mainstream audience, the queer fetish community is a part of the LGBTQ+ community, and they deserve your respect just as much as the queens on RuPaul's Drag Race, the gays that do your hair, every other person in the community. With all of this being said, the community isn't exactly easy to find. We don't really have a platform to accept us. Tumblr basically kicked us off years ago. In fact, as I film this video, Instagram has banned the word latex and is just about to implement terms that will essentially ban fetish from their platform completely. In addition to this, Pornhub and Xtube just did a mass removal of fetish content. Their goal was actually to get rid of child pornography and content by people that were trafficked into doing porn, which is a very admirable thing. But fetish-based content was caught up in the crossfire for seemingly no good reason. And now the community is just waiting for the pin to drop on Twitter and for that platform to remove us as well. And while there are platforms such as Recon and BDSMR, let's face it, they're a bit shit. However, all of these points that I've just brought up are also things that are affecting straight people. And it is worth noting, the queer experience in fetish and the straight one are very different. And so now I think it's a good time to bring up Chapter 3, the queer experience, but make it kinky. So, to put it in its most simple terms, the difference between queer fetish and straight fetish is a difference in aesthetic. I need to get rid of this can somehow. Daddy, help! Thank you. Now, obviously the idea that it all boils down to a difference in aesthetic is a sweeping generalization. But in my experience, the straight scene tends to focus more on opulence, more on highlighting sexual characteristics. The gay scene tends to be a bit more grimy and has a slightly stronger focus on gear in my experience. In fact, there's even a city in Europe with a very specific club, which I will not name, but what I will say, at this club, when you need to use the bathroom, instead of going to the bathroom, you go to an area where there's just these metal grates on the floor and you just piss through them. And below, there are people that are into piss play and they're just like showering in people's piss, drinking piss. It's disgusting, it's grimy, it's queer kink. So why all this grime? Why all these dark spaces? Do gay men not like opulence? No, gay men love opulence. In fact, one of the most iconic quotes from queer culture comes from Paris is Burning. And that quote is, "Opulence, you own everything." One of the similarities between straight and queer kink is that when a lot of people are outed as kinksters, it has the potential to ruin their lives or their entire careers. Some people even lose their entire jobs, they have to move. I've known someone that even had to start a whole new identity. Where this differs, however, is this is exactly what life was like for LGBTQ+ people before being gay was made legal. Society has obviously progressed since then for the more palatable LGBTQ+ community at large, but for the fetish scene, it's still, I wouldn't say the same, but it's still not great. And because of that, the grimy fetish clubs that you see now are the direct descendants of the grimy gay bars from back in the day, meaning the Stonewall bar where the Stonewall riots originated had a lot in common with modern fetish bars. However, one of the key differences between then and now is what gay men are doing in fetish is not illegal, but society does not accept it. Basically, being a kinkster or a fetishist in the queer community is the gay equivalent of being gay. I actually had an experience fairly recently. I was hanging out with a friend and I was scheduled to meet another friend at a fetish bar. We were just going for drinks, but she was like, "I don't really want to go home. Can I come with you?" And I had to explain to her the bar I was going to didn't let anyone in that wasn't a gay man. You could be cis or trans, you could even be non-binary so long as you were male presenting. Those were just the requirements to gain membership, to gain access to this bar. And my lesbian friend is a woman, obviously, and she's a vintage-loving lipstick lesbian. There was no way she was going to get into this bar. And I just want to clarify, this rule does not come from sexism. It comes from the fact that outside of COVID circumstances, there would be men having sex at this bar. She was actually shocked that a bar like this even existed. She knew about the lesbian bars that were dotted all over the UK, but she explained to me that those bars are really more made for women to have a safe space away from men. So where does this all fit into real life? Because as you can imagine, most kinksters and fetishists do have a normal job to support their expensive weird sex. I don't really want to get into people's jobs too much because, like I said before, most fetishists are incredibly private, to the point that it won't really affect their ability to have a job. In fact, I know one guy who, when we were at an event together, wouldn't even take off his hood if we were outside. But there are aspects of life that aren't work. For example, relationships. Now, I would say most guys on the scene do tend to have open relationships, even if they're in a relationship with someone who isn't into kink and fetish. Again, this just sort of facilitates a need, because no two people are going to have all the exact same kinks and fetishists, but fetishists are the kind of people that will want to explore those and sort of follow their urges, which is absolutely fine, but they need to have an open relationship so they can do that. The difficulty here is, having an open relationship is really difficult to explain to friends and family who are not on the scene. In general, non-standard relationship types for LGBTQ+ men are discriminated against. Previously, gay men could not give blood if they had had sex in 6 months, but it was recently shortened to 3 months. Now it's being changed so you can give blood provided that you are in a long-term monogamous relationship. So far, this has been incredibly negative. Let's talk about a positive. My friendships and bonds with the guys on the fetish scene are very, very unique. I don't have anything else like it in my life. I think it's because to get on the queer bus and then get out at the gay stop sort of takes a certain level of self-identification, but to then get out at the gay fetishist stop takes an even deeper level of self-identification. And I think that level of self-identification does fundamentally change you as a person. Now, like I said before, you really can't tell much about a person based on the types of sex they have. There are people in the scene I don't like, people I don't get along with. But no matter what, every person on this scene will have my respect for doing that level of self-identification. And it is my hope that they could carry that level of self-identification into every aspect of their life. With that said, it does bring up a good point. Chapter 4. Why are you the way you are? Short answer. I'm a degenerate mess. Roll credits. In all seriousness, I don't really enjoy putting too much focus on this topic. I feel that I am the way I am. I'm not hurting anyone, so why should I feel the need to justify it? However, it's not lost on me that making an entire video on the philosophy of kink and fetish may come across as trying to justify it. I am aware that ignoring questions doesn't really fly on the internet or in society at large. So let's look at science to learn more. It's generally accepted that experiences at the beginning of puberty may shape everyone's fetishes. However, it's also accepted that some people may be born with fetishes, and there's no single cause for a single fetish to exist, implying that fetishes may be a combination of genetics, neurological chemistry, and lived experiences. Dr. John Bancroft of the Kinsey Institute of Sex, Gender, and Reproduction suggests that a human cannot be conditioned into having a particular fetish. In multiple different experiments where men were conditioned to show arousal to boots, penny jars, and geometric shapes, not a single one of these men developed a fetish. This leads him to believe that fetishes develop in your neurological sexual development process. However, this same experiment was deemed successful in the 1960s, but I would argue that this experiment was unsuccessful. Basically, these men were shown naked ladies aside images of boots, so they came to associate boots with naked ladies. I would argue that a fetish is an inherent sexual attraction to that object. When these men were looking at these boots, they were thinking, naked lady. They were not thinking, wow, I want to be kicked to the ground and lick that boot like the good little dog I am. There's also the brain overlap theory, where basically the part of your brain that manages your sexual urges rubs up against the side that manages your feet. This is probably why some people have a foot fetish. Now, it is worth noting that fetishism is considered a disorder, but a diagnosis is rare because all humans have at least one fetish. Treatment is only given if you need help to achieve a normal level of sadness and dysfunction in your life, whatever that looks like for you. So I guess the answer to why do fetishes form is, I don't know, but neither do you. But all of this science only gets us so far, and I actually don't feel that it's entirely relevant to the conversation we should be having. I think the real question that people want to ask fetishists is, why do you feel the need to express yourself in this way? And the answer to that will be different for everyone, but I think a very generalized answer is, for us, it's natural. For me, fetish is just as much part of my identity as being gay. I never felt really at home around generic gay men circles, but then when I found the fetish community and started hanging around gay men in those circles, I finally felt at home. I finally felt like I understood what the fuck was going on with me, and I asked a friend if the same was true for him when he got into the scene, and his answer was yeah. He actually ended up moving country to be in a place where there was more fetish. Some see it as perverse, others will see it as weird, but I really think that very few of us choose this lifestyle. Most of us are just naturally drawn to it. So if you've made it this far into the video, you're probably thinking one of two things. Number one, hey, this isn't a video about comic books. To which I say, oh shit, you're right. And number two, so like, what are your fetishes? Which brings us on
Chapter 5. These are my favorite degenerate things.
How do I get into this? Ha ha ha. I love the taste of Italian piss water. So I really don't want to get too into my own kinks and fetishes here on YouTube. It just feels a bit too vulnerable. But I spoke about my thing to do with rubber at the beginning of this video. I kind of love guys in leather. I really like the more modern take on the leather daddy look, where it's a more muscular but smooth guy in leather. Something about it just makes me weak. But when I really boil everything down to what I like, I think my main thing is power dynamics. I'm a pure sub, 100% passive. I like doms who can take full control of a scene and sort of take full control of me. But I also need them to recognize that when a scene ends, it ends. I have a lot that I need to do with my life. I'm a fucking human, and I need them to recognize that. I have a lot of stuff that I want to do with my time on this planet, and as much as being a rubber slave full-time does sound amazing, I also really want to be an actual himbo bodybuilder, icon, legend, and star. Two aren't really compatible. But throwing back to how all of this can be traced back to childhood retrospectively. Growing up, I did 3 sports: gymnastics, figure skating, and swimming. When I was about 12 years old, I sort of found myself having feelings for guys in Speedos. A feeling that I didn't recognize. This feeling scared me so much because I had no idea what it was, and while I was already aware that I was gay, I didn't need to be dealing with this on top of being gay. So I just quit swimming. Years later, looking back, I can now say that that unexplainable, incredibly intense feeling was a fetish for guys in Speedos. Now, this is actually an incredibly common fetish, but at the time I was like, oh no, this could lead to a downward spiral. And now look at me. I just really want my face pressed against a guy's Speedo bulge, preferably red Speedos. Power dynamics, lifeguard, follow the trend. And I'm not the only comic book YouTuber with experience in kink and fetish. In fact, in preparation for this video, I actually reached out to Comic Book Girl 19, otherwise now known as Danica, and they had this to say.
And I would like to tell you a story of my kinky comic book party. I was 100% inspired by the Hellfire Club from the X-Men. The X-Men are near and dear to my heart. And when I was throwing a fashion launch party for my X-Men themed casual cosplay wear, I was like, I have to do a Hellfire Club party because those are the people that throw the lit parties in the X-Men universe. And I personally dressed up as the Black Queen, and this is when Jean, right before she goes Dark Phoenix, and she's wearing this super kinky outfit. The Hellfire Club, if you didn't know, is a very BDSM-inspired secret society of aristocrats who do all this weird orgiastic kinky shit together. I personally got up on stage and put on a little show for everybody and let the Black King flog me publicly. I was publicly flogged. I was living my X-Men BDSM dreams. It was amazing. I was watching Sebastian Shaw flog Magneto while Mystique was like taking pictures and video, and like all of us X-Men villains were all standing around like smirking in this underground club in Hollywood, and it was so surreal. Like I felt like I had literally like transported the Hellfire Club from the comics into real life and got to live it. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at and Twitch at DanicaXIX, and on YouTube at comicbookgirl19. And if you want to know more about the Dark Phoenix saga, which is what the Hellfire Club comes from, you can watch my Epic History X-Men series parts. Well, 1 is not that, but 2 and 3. 2 and 3 are all about the Phoenix business. The 1's just like talks about where the X-Men came from and like up to that point. All right, anyways. Thanks for talking, guys.
But I should add in a disclaimer after that clip. Just because Danica and I are both into fetish doesn't mean that it's all that common in queer comic book fans. It's not, but it does make sense that comic books would attract us because, let's face it, superheroes spend half their time dressed as expensive looking gimps. Alright, so let's review what we've discussed, shall we? Kink and fetish are two separate things that have a lot of crossover, but all kinks are fetishes. The queer fetish scene is inherently tied to LGBTQ+ queer history, and that's why you have to have kink and fetish at Pride. The queer fetish scene directly inherited itself from the gay bars of old. That's why it's a lot more grimy, aesthetically speaking, than the straight scene, and why it's inherently separate from the straight scene as well. There is no single formulaic reason why a person would form a fetish. It's widely not understood. But for people with these feelings, they're the most natural thing ever. And finally, Speedo bulges are hot. So before this video finishes, I do just want to give a huge thank you and shout out and recommendation to Mr. RIEGILLIO for working with me on this video. When I knew I was going to make this video, I reached out to them. I do think it's important to make kink and fetish a bit more accessible. I don't think that it should ever be mainstream. I think that sort of defeats the point of it, but I do think accessibility is good. And what they do is they make it incredibly accessible, and they allow people to try out different fetishes while also remaining true to the core of what that fetish is, which is so important. I personally chose this particular tracksuit because it does balance out fetish and fashion, and they do a lot of that, and I kind of wanted to show that off so it's a bit more safe for YouTube. But hopefully they will work with me in the future because I would like to show the full range of what they do. Their leather stuff, in my opinion, is amazing. There is a link down below to their website. Please go and check them out. And finally, I just have to say, Happy fucking New Year, you degenerate sluts. You know what? It just looks like I've been playing. You see what I do for you people? You ungrateful leeches? I've had to employ a bimbo.
I can't fucking believe you've done this.